Good morning. You're listening to Central Wisconsin's 24-hour information station, AM 1320 WFHR. It's time now for the Morning Magazine, brought to you by Comfort Air Heating, Cooling, Plumbing.
Morning Magazine for this September 30th, 2020. Your host, James J. Maloff here. And for the entire hour today, we're going to be joined by candidate for the 72nd Assembly, Criste Greening. Good morning, Miss Greening.
Good morning. How are you today?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
I appreciate you joining us so much. So you and yours, everybody holding up okay right now?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. You know, regardless of the weather that we have today, we're doing all right.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Criste, we're going to get into your run here for Assembly and talk about why you're doing this and a bunch of other things. But we haven't gotten a chance to meet you before and talk to you. So if you don't mind, I'd like to get a little bit of your origin story, a little bit of your background, and why you decided to run for a political office, especially that latter part there, because for some of us, we can't understand why anybody would do this. So we do definitely want to be able to kind of get to know you a little bit more here. Can we kind of start with your backstory?
Sure, that sounds great. Well, as you stated, my name is Criste Greening, and I am running for the 72nd State Assembly District against incumbent Scott Crew. I was born and raised right here in central Wisconsin, actually graduating from Nakusa High School and residing in the small township of Saratoga, which is just south of, the city of Wisconsin Rapids. I'm a wife of almost 20 years. I have 3 beautiful young adult children and a former public school teacher from right here in the area. For the last 8 years, I have been a grassroots organizer, clean water and environmental advocate, and a community volunteer. So depending on what day of the week it is and what's on my calendar, I have a different ad on just about every day. On the professional side of things, I have a master's degree in education. The special education arena is where I have done all my work in education. I worked for both as a teacher and a director of an alternative school, and eventually transferred to public school when my kids were of school age, so that my school calendar was very similar, if not exactly in line with theirs. I taught in school for about 15 years, probably a little bit more than 15 years in education. Many of those years, like I said, right here in the Wisconsin Rapids Public School. But I eventually left education in 2015. So, and on top of all those other things that I do, my husband and I also have a small business which keeps us busy during the fall and the winter months.
One of the things, doing a little homework on you, Criste, and I've actually sort of followed your career for a little while here because you've done a lot at the State Assembly and spoke up on a lot of important issues that I've noticed and seen your name before and everything. So we certainly have, you've been in the public eye a bit already, but you've never really had any interest in politics. In fact, from what I've read, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from what I've read, you had never looked at politics before. This was not on your bucket list or anything.
It absolutely was not on the bucket list. If you would have asked me, even just a few years ago, if I was interested in running for public office, it was never on my radar. It's definitely not something that was in my bucket list. And I think I'm much like countless individuals in our local community and really across our state that are simply fed up with the constant fighting between the political parties. Sick and tired of the party line voting and elected officials who are completely unwilling to listen to the constituents or even meet each other halfway to promote policy for the betterment of Wisconsin. So you're right. Running for public office was not in the plans. For me personally, probably back in 2012, the community where I reside, the township of Saratoga, was blindsided by the announcement of the concentrated animal feeding operation that was trying to move into our community. And as a result of that announcement is when I truly became heavily involved in the political happenings across the state and specifically in the environmental and water side of things. That fight has lasted over 8 years and continues. And throughout that time, my advocacy for clean water and the environment and standing up for citizens' rights has definitely continued to grow. And without even knowing it, I suddenly found myself traveling all over the state, being a guest speaker at numerous events, helping out other small communities just like Saratoga to get themselves organized and fight back against water contamination contamination issues happening within their rural communities. And my presence within the environmental and grassroots community kind of took on a life of its own. But what I have realized over the last 8 years, and that I have clearly discovered, and as have others in the area, that our voices, across the state in numerous districts, and specifically here in the 72nd, are completely being ignored by our elected representatives in favor of the party politics, the partisan platforms, the big money donors. I remember sitting on my couch here at the beginning of May, here just a few months ago, literally wondering to myself, who's going to step up against Scott Krug? Because at that time, no one had made any announcement. There was nothing but the sound of crickets in the air when we talked about who was going to be running against, incumbent Krug. 2 weeks later, I found myself still sitting on the couch thinking, oh my gosh, nobody has stepped up to run against him. Who is going to run against Scott Krug? And it was at that time that I recalled something that I had often said to the residents of Saratoga, especially when we were in the midst of the huge fight against Wysocki and the factory farm. And that was, we are not going to beat Wysocki by sitting on the couch. We all needed to get up and take a stand. And whenever an opportunity arose, we needed to be there and be ready. And that really, for me, was my look at yourself in the mirror moment. The practice what you preach and get off the couch turning point. Yeah, I had been actually asked to run for political office before from both sides of the fence. So that truly shows you that I am truly an independent. But the long story short, it was literally within 24 hours of thinking that to myself, that the Democratic Party had reached out to me and asked if I would consider running under the Democratic flag.
And so it sounds like this was more of an organic thing than a long-term plan, that this was something that kind of happened because you wanted to be a part of this. You wanted to make a change, make things different, but you didn't need to be the lead dog in that. But as it turns out, somebody needed to be, so you stepped up to do that.
Really, that is an excellent way to put it. I had no expectation of being the lead dog. My personality in general is when something needs to get done, I roll up my sleeves and let's go. And that often has put me in a leadership position. But this is not something that I had, like I said before, was not on my bucket list. Once I had that call from the Democratic Party, there was, of course, numerous discussions that had to be had. First one being with my family, who surprisingly to me were incredibly supportive. I did then speak with folks within the party to make sure that if I chose to run under the Democratic flag, that I could truly keep my independence as an independent voter and truly represent the people of this district with the ethics and the integrity that I hold myself to, regardless of what the party is going to be pushing under their, specific platform. Yeah. I was able to walk away from those discussions completely confident that I am in the right place. Many of the things that I believe in as a solid independent, education, environment, strong workforce, livable wage, are definitely things that the Democratic Party also holds clear. But I was given the freedom to run my campaign however I see fit and to promote myself, truly as the independent voter that I am.
Appreciate the behind the curtain look there at that, because that's not only interesting for us, but as voters and as citizens, I feel like we should know more of those stories. We should know more of that thing, and more politicians should be transparent about that kind of thing, because really, we've gotten so far away from where people forgetting who has the power. It is not the politicians, it's the people that vote. It's the citizens. And getting back to that a little bit more and being reminded of that, like in times like this, it's always helpful. I want to get into with you your work on clean water, the environment community, and all of that, because it's really important and great work that you have done. And I know it's an important issue to so many people out there. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, and don't worry, we're going to have some fun a little bit later. We're going to talk dogs a little bit later, Criste, so we will have some fun in this interview. But I have to ask some certain questions, and one of them, as somebody who already came from a rough world in the teaching world, to then, you're supposed to be kind of taking it a little bit easier the older you get. You dive into an even tougher one in politics. And as a kid who grew up really romanticizing politics, I grew up in a political family. I know the stories of so many of these organizations and different things. And the older I get, the more it just becomes more of a sideshow to me. It's gotten so far away from this respectful game that is played between two parties and us citizens, and now has become this kind of like two kids in a sandbox yelling at each other. Coming from the Democratic side, you are going into something where, and I won't say this necessarily about your opponent and Mr. Krug, but just in general with the way that the Republican Party has been, when you have a fact, they just come back with, that's not true. Like,
right.
How do you combat something like that when all you're trying to do is bring true facts to the argument, and all they have to do to diminish your point is say that's not true? How do you combat something like that?
I really appreciate that question, because throughout my campaign, I've been struggling with the fact that I do not, under any circumstances, want to run what they call a dirty campaign or a mudslinging campaign. But I do feel it's very important to hold, in this case for me, Scott Krug, accountable to his voting record. And with all the grassroots groups that I have worked with, I think any one of them on my team throughout the years will tell you that I am adamant that I do not make a statement that I can't back up with fact. Because if you can't back it up with fact, it's a rumor or it's made up or it's slander, whatever the case may be, but you lose integrity in who you are when you can't prove a statement that you've made. Yeah. So for me personally, throughout this campaign, when I put out mailers or I put out statements, I have a link right on my campaign webpage, which is www.greeningforassembly.com, that literally states incumbent Krug's voting record. So when I put out a mailer that stated, he voted in favor of, or continuously voted in favor of bills that reduced protections for our water and our environment, I have a whole page listing every bill, the text to the bill, the page that shows his voting record in favor of that bill. That's the integrity that I hold myself to. And so when you're right, you do get that, well, that's false or this is false. I can go back and say, here it is. And at least let the citizens make an educated decision on if they believe that legislation or if they don't believe that legislation. I can rest knowing that I supplied the documentation that I'm not lying, that I'm not throwing mud or just trying to throw somebody under the bus.
I can say that, I'm not tied to either party. I'm a big believer in going for what the people need and what is best for my community and that sort of thing. But I can say that as just somebody who talks to all sides here and everything, especially in this job, that's so appreciated. And it's something that I talk about with all of our representatives and everybody we have on the air with us, is getting away from that dirty style of politics, that childish style of politics, that whiny politics, in acting like adults. We've got a lot of generations looking at this current generation and what's going on right now, and they're either learning what to do or learning what not to do, and giving an example of that. I really want to give some time to the work that you have done on clean water and environment. You've touched on that a little bit. Can we kind of give people a little bit of a backstory on what the work that you have done when it comes to that?
Sure. Thank you. I will preface that question with saying that my jump into advocating for clean water wasn't necessarily just because of the CAFO situation to Saratoga. I had a deep appreciation for clean water and our environment long before that started. I grew up playing in the creek behind my house, which was just a short jaunt through the woods, and vacationing on the Petenwell Flowage, where some summers you jump into the water and you come out looking like the Incredible Hulk because of the algae, and other years it was completely clean and we couldn't figure it out. So I have always had a deep appreciation for a clean environment, our Wisconsin waterways, and our natural resources. And I think throughout my younger years and even my young adult years, I sincerely took for granted that Wisconsin had always been known as a conservation state, the protector of its natural resources. States from all over the nation would look to Wisconsin for leadership on conservation issues. And it wasn't until 2012 and the proposal of the Wysocki CAFO that I realized the drastic change that our legislature had taken and the elected officials at the state level had taken in regards to protecting our natural resources and our conservation heritage. And I really started paying attention at that time to the legislative bills, and I was appalled at how many were being proposed that constantly reduced environmental protections to our ground and surface water. And that's when I started heading to Madison. That's when I started rallying, I call it rallying the troops in our local community and the local grassroots groups that I was involved with to start testifying down in Madison in front of state and or Senate and Assembly committees in opposition of those bills that were reducing our protections for our natural environment. I started attending public hearings held with the Wisconsin DNR, participating as a citizen observer on countless technical committees and task force all over the state. I literally have traveled all over the state, encouraging others within communities and extended grassroots groups to speak up and contact their local representatives, and often having to essentially teach them. This is how you call your representative. This is how you advocate what you need. These are the terms and the statements you need to use to clarify to them what it is you want. And it was at that time in my advocacy work on the statewide level that things really took off. For years, I sat on the board of directors for the Sustain Rural Wisconsin Network, which is a statewide coalition of individuals and organizations working to protect the environment, while maintaining the health of our economy of our rural communities. I have been asked to speak at numerous events being held within the UW system on grassroots organizing and citizen advocacy. And along with two very dear friends of mine, we formed the Citizens Water Coalition of Wisconsin and arranged and hosted the largest citizens organized advocacy lobby down at our state capitol, which revolved all around the water issues. So,
you mentioned the case from 2012 a couple of times. For those that may not know about that, can we give them a little bit of backstory on that?
Sure. So in 2012, our small community of Saratoga was hit with the proposal for a concentrated animal feeding operation, which is, many people refer to it as, the factory farm or industrialized agriculture. But essentially what it is thousands upon thousands of dairy cows all within, one facility or one main building. And the proposal for Saratoga initially was to clear cut over 6,000 acres of our wooded lands in the area and turn it into agricultural crop fields, and then to spray those fields with the liquid manure from the large industrial-sized dairy. And when that proposal was made in 2012, our local community, and numerous leaders from within our local community stepped up to fight against that proposal. And this has been over 8 years now, and the farm is still not here. And there is, the permits are still within the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, so we cannot say that the farm is not coming. We have done everything we can to prevent it, and if they would try to come in again, we would definitely land ourselves back in court again. But the town of Saratoga, that case actually went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And, there was hundreds of residents in the township of Saratoga that did everything they needed to do over, especially those first 5 years, to work together. We were essentially a community of strangers back in 2012, and now we are a community of family. We joined together over one united cause and put up the David and Goliath fight, really is what we did. And Saratoga remains as it was back in 2012.
Before we go to break here, I would like to touch on, especially since we're kind of in that field anyway, water concerns statewide and some of the past damaging legislation that you spoke of there, and kind of speaking on that a little bit.
I'm sorry, could you say that question? I thought we were going to break, so I kind of missed
yeah, sorry. I meant just before we got about 5 minutes before we go to break, and I thought since we were already talking water and the environment, just kind of touching on that a little bit about some of the concerns. You have hit on some of this already, but some of these water concerns statewide and past damaging legislation as you've spoken to.
Okay, sure, thank you. Definitely across the state of Wisconsin, we have a variety of different water concerns that are occurring. Right here in the Central Stands, we have excessively high nitrates over in the Armenia area. We have what the new PFAS situation, which is the forever chemicals that are happening across our state as well. And we currently, right now, we have flooding in our central Wisconsin area, and a few years back, we had record low lake levels. There's been just an influx of a variety of different contaminants coming into our waterway and issues that are happening. I think one of the most damaging pieces of legislation that was passed was the repealing of the Prove It First Mining Act, which essentially reintroduces industrial acid mining to our state, which the EPA has tagged as the dirtiest industry in America, having the hugest impact to our local waterways. We had a moratorium on Prove It First moratorium on mining in Wisconsin for years. It was a bipartisan bill that was supported by both parties. And out of nowhere, that bill came back and the repealing of that act happened. That is something that could be extremely damaging to the state of Wisconsin. We've had bills that have reduced the protection of our navigable waterways and reduced non-point source pollution standards. We've had a huge impact to wetland legislation, removing protections for identified wetlands. There's just a variety of legislation regarding water that systematically has been picked away at, that when you look at all of it, all encompassing, it is a huge amount of concern that in all aspects, in all industries, these protections have been removed, and our waters are continuing to get dirty. They are continuing to be more at risk. And the three areas that I have mentioned, my opponent, incumbent Krug, has mentioned often that he is all for clean water and for the environment. He voted in favor of every single one of those bills I just mentioned. And so when I look at honesty, integrity, and being a representative, you cannot ethically say that you support clean water and yet continuously vote in favor of legislation that puts our water resources at risk. And that same scenario has played out countless times over and over with Representative Krug over the last 8 years.
Speaking with State Assembly candidate Criste Greening right now, and I really do appreciate the time, Criste. When we come back, I'd like to touch on public education funding with you.
Oh, great.
We'll be back.
Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll be back with more with Criste Greening here on Morning Magazine, AM 1320. And welcome to part 2 of Morning Magazine, where we are speaking with a candidate for the 72nd Assembly, Criste Greening. And thank you again for joining us, Criste.
Thank you.
You mentioned before when we were talking about your backstory and everything, your history with education and being a teacher and your master's. So I was looking forward to getting into this topic with you. I think it's one of the more important ones that we don't get a chance to put a spotlight on often enough, and that's education and public education funding. Can you tell us where you come from on that?
I'm sorry, your phone cut out just a little bit. Could you ask that question one more time?
Sure. I wanted to get your opinion on public education funding.
Okay, thank you. Well, no doubt, as a public education or former public education teacher, I can definitely unapologetically say that our public schools right now, as of today, are underfunded. They are not being funded at appropriate levels that they need to maintain the level of education that Wisconsinites have always been accustomed to. Over the years, both being in the education system and most recently trying to connect with constituents across the 72nd District, I am hearing very negative accusations, actually, directed at administrators or school board members, being blamed for the lack of funding or inappropriate spending. And I don't feel that the citizens, mainly of Wisconsin, really understand what has happened to our educational funding in Wisconsin over the past few years and how essentially crippling some of the state budgets have been to our public school system. You know, our education budget here in Wisconsin is made up of two factors. There's state aid, the money that we get from the state, and the local revenue within your community. And so essentially whatever is not covered by state aid, the local community is made to pick up through their tax dollars or their revenue. So dating back all the way to 1993, revenue limits were placed on communities to ensure that the local residents essentially would be taxed to death to pay for the school system. The revenue caps were not bad. They were assigned dollar amounts for each individual student saying how much a district can pay, to educate any individual student throughout the district. Each year, that level of revenue was adjusted for inflation. So it kept up with inflation. It was a workable solution. Unfortunately, almost a decade ago, when the Walker administration took over, those revenue caps were frozen. So almost a decade ago, wherever the student level was, for example, $8,000 per student per district, was frozen. And no longer could they adjust that rate for the rate of inflation. So you're looking at almost 10 years, a decade, of a district's ability to still have to pay higher tax or higher costs for services and supplies, but not being able to adjust through the community through taxes or revenue increases the amount that they need to make up. Fast forward to 2012, that seems to just be a devastating year for some of us, was the biggest cut to education we've ever seen. $792 million in direct state aid from kindergarten through 12th grade over a 2-year period. This was a devastating blow to our school districts, who were already struggling due to the revenue freezes. 2 years later, we had a huge expansion of the charter school and the private school voucher programs. That funding is taken right off the top of our public school funding dollars. And on top of all of that, you have all three working together, things adding up: the revenue cost, the revenue freeze, the budget cuts, the voucher expansion, and schools were left fumbling. There was just simply not enough money to go around to keep some schools even open in our smaller rural communities. The Wisconsin State Legislature did see the dire circumstance that they had created. It was created by our state legislature. This was not something that was created by our local school districts. So in 2017, that state budget, an increase to school funding, it was wonderful. $639 million. It was hailed as the biggest, most historic investment in public school ever. But what people tend to forget is that just years prior, they had reduced that budget by $792 million. They had placed that revenue freeze on top of that and were paying for voucher programs. So currently, as of this year, our funding for our public schools are at levels below where they were way back in 2011. And again this year, as the school year started, we expanded the voucher program once again, which is taking money directly away from our public school system.
Now, when it comes to, so I know that as we get older and the farther we get away from school, many of us that don't continue our education or have children kind of forget a little bit of what it was like to be in grade school, be in high school and that sort of thing. And one of the things that you learn as a teacher of young minds, or if you are a parent, or even any interacting you have with your nieces and nephews or any of this, is you realize, I have to kind of put myself back in that mindset. I have to remember what it was like when the world was so popularity was so important, and some of these things that are important to kids. Do you feel like that is that detachment that as we become older is part of the reason why we put cuts into education and think we can afford to do that? Because I talk to our citizens, I talk to people out there, they're smart people, they understand that that doing that, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, that these next generations that are supposed to be taking over, they're being shortcut education, and they're not going to be as equipped to take over for us in our jobs or in political fields or anything if we don't take care of them.
Right.
What rationale have you heard for making these kind of cuts?
There has been a slew of rationale. Some folks just really don't understand the cost of education and what it entails. It's not just books and supplies in a building. It's transportation. It's special education. It's free and reduced lunch. There's so many caveats and categorical funding that goes into a public education that, for even me, who is someone that is fairly versed in it, it is very hard to wrap your mind around. You also have the mindset of, when I was in school, we had one welding class, one art class, and everybody had to take home ec, and we turned out just fine.
Yeah.
Well, so you do deal with, and I have faith that mindset of, it was fine for me back then. It should be fine for kids now, and not really addressing the fact that society has changed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as simplistic as it was back in the day. There is a ton of different caveats that go into funding the public school system. And, I am not against the voucher school system. It probably came across that way a little while ago. I will openly go on record to state that there is a place in Wisconsin for the private school and voucher school, monies for those programs. But I do not support funding either of those programs as a priority over funding our public school system first. We are constitutionally obligated to provide a free, appropriate public education for any student that walks through the door. And right now in the state of Wisconsin, we are funding two educational systems. And we are giving priority to the private school charter voucher program than we are to public school education. The best way I can describe it is to explain it as a pizza party. So bear with me here a minute. Imagine you have 6 friends sitting around the table, and you're going to be sharing a pizza, which you cut into six equal slices or equal pieces. Everybody's going to get one chunk of that pizza. And suddenly, 3 unexpected friends show up. And in their hand, they have a voucher that guarantees them a full slice of the pizza. Regardless of the fact that you now have 9 people in the room, 3 of those individuals are guaranteed a full slice. And so they take their slice of pizza, and the 6 remaining individuals have to share the rest. That is exactly what's happening with our public school state aid and our funding for public school. Each voucher that is offered is guaranteed a specific amount of money per student. Right now we have 43,500 students that participate on the voucher program. Each one of those students is guaranteed a specific amount of money for their specific institution that they're going to be going to. That money is taken right off the top of that educational state aid fund. And whatever is left after all the vouchers are taken out is what is finally distributed to the public schools. That is fundamentally backwards. We are constitutionally obligated and should be putting public school funding first. By taking voucher money off the top first, there are schools in the state of Wisconsin that do not have a single student that has left their facility to go to a voucher program. Yet they're being penalized by having that money removed first. Their school is receiving less funding. So, to me, it is fundamentally backwards. We must put public school funding as our first priority.
To kind of piggyback off that, it feels like this kind of speaks to one of the overall concerns here for me, and I know a lot of citizens that I talk to, and this lack of empathy that goes on in today with so many of our voting people and so many of our older people. And I don't mean seniors. I mean people my age. I mean, just anybody above the age of 21, basically, where it's almost it seems like a rocket science to ask them to put themselves in somebody else's shoes, or understand that they can't know what it's like to be in another person's shoes. I go through this all the time when it comes up with certain terms or certain organizations and not grouping them all together, these kind of things. What have you heard or you felt? You've been, you're on the campaign trail. You're out there actually really, really speaking with the people and everything. Have you noticed any of that, or have you seen more so the opposite, that the people are empathetic, they're just not being represented, that empathy is not being represented?
I very happily can say I do see the opposite. Mm-hmm. What is very apparent, though, is those individuals that may have that more gruff demeanor and maybe that more polarizing opinion tend to speak a lot louder and a lot more aggressive. And the others just tend to keep their thoughts to themselves and not voice them as loudly. So, I hear exactly what you're saying, that there is that, or or that reflection of the community that there is such an intolerance of one side or the other. And I do see that as well. But I am happy to report there is a mass amount of constituents and people within our communities that don't feel that way. That they're right here with me in the middle of the road, reaching their hands out to both sides and saying, let's have a conversation. But they're getting talked over the top of. And until somebody picks up that movement or somebody is that person that's going to join me in the middle of the road and say, okay, let's do this. Let's all work together. Let's move forward. I'm going to be continuing to stand in the middle of the road by myself. So I often tell my kids, it only takes one person to initiate change. It takes welcoming other people into the group to move it forward. And I'm here. I'm in the middle of the road. I'm ready to initiate change, and I need to know who's going to be with me, because we can't continue in the state of Wisconsin in the way that we are. I mean, it is benefiting absolutely nobody. The party politics, the constant arguing, taking each other to court over every little decision that is made in our legislature is ridiculous, and it is a waste of our taxpayer money. You know, somebody needs to stand up and say it is enough. And it's going to take all of us going to the polls and voting. We have had enough. Everybody needs to stand in the middle of the road with me, and we need to move this idea to Madison.
I'm a big believer in what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, in that you can't defeat hate with hate. Only love can defeat hate. My concern is that you were talking about, you know, speaking to kind of volume. And I know, coming from an Italian family, that the only way to be heard, it felt sometimes, was to talk louder than my parents or something like that. And it sounded like we were yelling at each other when we were basically just talking to each other. But that has turned into the world of politics now, where you, again, kind of going back to this thing where I say a fact and the other party, all they have to do is say, oh, that's not true. Well, or talk louder than you, or turn the argument around. We're not having discussions. We're just having these little arguments, these little spats, like a bunch of grade schoolers. And so when it comes to that, do you feel like we're either going to get to a point, or we're at that point where, for your side of things, you have to kind of fight fire with fire?
Yeah, I definitely have no misconceived notions or grandiose ideas that if I do make it into public office, that I'm going to be able to go down to Madison and change the world. You're right. When I go down there is still going to be the screaming at each other, the bickering on both sides. One thing that I think I do have in my favor, for as many years as I've been going down to Madison and speaking with representatives, I never only spoke to my two representatives, Scott Krug and Patrick Teston, because quite honestly, I knew it wasn't going to go nowhere. So I had reached out to others on the Democratic side. I have reached out to others on the Republican side. I'm on a first-name basis with people on both sides. And there are folks within both parties that have the same mindset as I do. They're just sick and tired of what's going on in Madison. And so like I said, I have no misconceived notion that I'm going to go down to Madison if elected and, you know, bring the rainbows and flowers with me and everything is going to be fine. It's going to be an uphill battle no matter where I am. It's an uphill battle in this district because it's so gerrymandered. I have to, somehow let people understand who I am and what I stand for. And it's going to be an uphill battle down in Madison because they are so ingrained in their party platform and their politics that you're right. It's not going to be an easy task by any means, but we have to start somewhere.
Right. I appreciate you bringing up gerrymandering too. It's one of the more things that frustrates me when it comes to politics. Always has that. Just even that we have a term for something like this. Yeah. I want to get into that with you. We have one more break to take, and we'll get into that as soon as we come back. We are speaking with State Assembly candidate Criste Greening right now on Morning Magazine, AM 1320 WFHR.
The way I understand it, this person came into your home and stole all of your radios.
Every radio I had to my name.
Including transistors?
Yes. Well, he left me one earplug. I'll say that for him.
Well, did he take anything else?
Just the radios. And a couple of pieces of fruit.
I see. Well, what...
A banana and 2 Cadota figs. I don't deny him the fruit.
No. Are you and your husband going to replace the radios?
Well, we'll have to. Arthur is late for work because he has no radio to keep reminding him of the time and traffic conditions. I have nothing to keep me company while I work around the house.
I can imagine.
We have a 10-room house. We had a radio in every room.
Then he stole all 10 radios?
11.
11?
He also stole the car.
We love doing what we do. This is Colleen Swanevik. To see how WFHR can create magic for your business, call me today, 715-424-1300.
Here's your forecast from the Weather Eye Weather Center.
For today, expecting mostly cloudy skies with scattered showers, possibly a thunder shower into the afternoon with high temperatures in the upper 50s. Then for tonight, mostly cloudy, still lingering slight chance for rain will drop back to a low of 42. And into your Thursday, a chance for showers there with highs up to 53. Some areas of frost then for Thursday night, low 30s. From the Weatherology Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Michael Caro.
46 in Stevens Point, 47 in Marshfield and Wausau, 48 in Wisconsin Rapids, where you have Morning Magazine. We are joined by State Assembly candidate Criste Greening today. And again, thank you for joining us, Criste.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here.
We are going to get into gerrymandering right now and the Fair Maps Pledge. And can we let people know what you mean by that?
Yes. Gerrymandering is, every 10 years after the census comes out, whatever political party is in office, rearranges the district maps for the Assembly and the Senate. Gerrymandering specifically is when they arrange those districts to ensure that their political party is going to win that particular district. So when you look at the state of Wisconsin, if you ever Google gerrymandering or Google Wisconsin legislative map, you will see these very wonky shaped maps that some are extremely long and stretch all the way across the state, and some are very tiny squares, very specific. And it's all due to wanting to make sure that the current party in office or leader in office, majority party, is going to be able to win that seat within the next election.
When it comes to preventing gerrymandering for either party in the future, is there a way to do that?
Right now, there is what they're calling the Fair Maps Pledge, and this is a variety of groups around the state of Wisconsin that are asking both legislators that are in office right now and elected candidates like myself to sign on to the Fair Maps Pledge, which means once the maps are redrawn, they're going to be redrawn next year or for next year, that a nonpartisan redistricting committee is in charge of doing that. It is meant to take party politics out of redrawing those maps. So no Republican, no Democrat, majority or minority get to have their hands involved in drawing the maps. And I signed on to that Fair Maps Pledge immediately upon declaring my candidacy. I support a nonpartisan redistricting process 100%. And I'm highly concerned with any candidate that I hear either running for political office or that is currently in political office that is refusing to sign on to that pledge. It really says a lot about one's character and one's ethics. Gerrymandering in general simply distorts and ignores the voices of the people. I mean, it's that simple. An individual's vote is one of the most sacred rights that we have as an American. And any attempt to purposely weaken the power of the people's voice in favor of any one political party is completely unethical and it's unacceptable. So, as our current representatives really do not need to listen to their constituents at this point, because the boundaries are drawn in such a way that they can essentially do whatever they want throughout their entire term. And when re-election time comes, they're almost guaranteed their seat. So I know for me right here in the 72nd, it is a severely gerrymandered district. I know that I need to pull a very large amount of votes from the Republican side of the fence in order to even have a fighting chance moving forward in this election. And it's simply my everyday reality as I campaign, throughout this district. And historically, gerrymandering has occurred with both political parties. Neither one is innocent of the crooked and the manipulating behavior. If elected, not only would I support a nonpartisan redistricting commission, I would like to see that go one step further and make it an amendment to the Wisconsin State Constitution requiring it in all redistricting moving forward. The voters should always choose their representatives. It should never, ever be the other way around.
Yeah, gerrymandering for me reminds me too much of what this country was started as, getting away from royalty. Getting away from kings and queens and the people that were never being able to be taken out of office, and putting the power in the people's hands. Gerrymandering takes it out of their hands. And so that's one of those things. I appreciate you mentioning both parties, because as a kid, I grew up in a very both bipartisan household. We had Republicans and Democrats in all parts of our family. And the thing that turned me off from both parties was that gerrymandering both parties were guilty of it. And to me, it's one of those things that we need to, I think, all come to an agreement on, as saying, we can't be doing this. We need to let people decide who is in these positions. And once you are in office, that can be taken away. That if you are not doing your job, if you're not representing the people, that you shouldn't be in that spot. Somebody that does represent the people should be there. It feels almost like the most basic part of politics, but it seems like one of those things that the longer we've gone along here, gerrymandering has become just such a common thing that we've almost accepted it. And fighting back against that is important for all citizens. It doesn't matter if you have an R or D or an I in front of your name. It should be important to all of us.
I agree with you 100%. And when you look at what has happened we'll just focus on the Wisconsin politics down in Madison, I hear from constituents on both sides of the fence how, sick and tired they are of representatives not listening to them. It is because of gerrymandering that they are seeing that behavior. Essentially, most of the legislators don't have to listen to their constituents and are almost, like I said, guaranteed their seat back, simply because of how the lines were drawn in regards to specific districts. And it is sincerely disheartening, because I do believe in representative governance, and you do not get that when districts are as gerrymandered as we have here in Wisconsin.
There's all these topics we're talking about. I want to spend at least an hour talking about with you. And I apologize that we have to kind of keep moving here and everything. But I did want to give you a chance to touch on some of the healthcare concerns you have with the state.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you very much. I do appreciate being able to address the healthcare situation, especially right now here in Wisconsin. We have a teetering economy, and our high employment rate right now means that people are losing their health care coverage at a time when it is needed the most. Wisconsin is one of only, I believe, 8 states left in the nation that has yet to accept the federal Medicaid funds for expansion, which would provide an estimated 82,000 Wisconsinites with health care coverage. We have already missed out on an estimated $1.1 billion in federal money from when this was first offered to all the states years ago. So not only did we not accept the Medicaid funds years ago, but Wisconsin still chose to expand the program anyway. And what happened is that additional cost was passed on to the shoulders of our Wisconsin taxpaying citizens. It makes no sense, and is hurting the pocketbooks of the citizens of this state. Numerous polls and surveys that have been conducted show a solid 70% of Wisconsinites disagree with leaving the federal money sit on the table and feel Wisconsin should accept the federal dollars. But again, voices are being ignored. And the bottom line is the expansion of the federal Medicaid would have made health care more affordable for 82,000 adults. It would have helped hold down the cost of individual insurance plans, which have skyrocketed here in Wisconsin, and would have captured Wisconsin's fair share of the federal funding for Medicaid that 42 other states have already been using to improve their health care services throughout their communities. So considering the healthcare crisis that is playing out in this state right now, the continued refusal to accept the federal expansion money is literally costing people their life. There is no justification for the refusal of the expansion money, and the majority in power needs to get past the pettiness of rejecting it simply because it was instituted by the wrong political party. That is the only reason they're continuing to allow all that money that we could be using here in the state of Wisconsin to sit on the table and not accept it. It is, it's almost criminal to me because people are suffering and we have an avenue to assist and it's not being looked at.
I appreciate the feedback on that, Criste. And before we let you go, I promised you some fun. I want to talk doggy with you a little bit because doing a little homework on you and everything, I noticed that you and your husband, that your family, that you fostered a couple of times.
We have. As my children got older, when they were younger, I was a Daisy and Girl Scout leader. When my son was in football, I sat on the football board of directors. And now that my kids are older and gone, I am doing something I enjoy, which is providing foster services for the Southwood County Humane Society. We definitely had a dog in that had pups. It was 6 or 8 pups, I think, at the time. But mainly I take in felines. I take in cats. Okay. And I can tell you I've had hundreds of kittens within my household in the last 2 years. Not exactly to the enjoyment of my husband, but he works out of state a lot. So a lot of times it's just me and all the mamas and the babies, and I truly enjoy it. It's something I thoroughly enjoy. And the Southwood County Humane Society does an awesome job here in town and can always use donations and support. So shout out to the listeners to help out the Southwood County Humane Society.
Yeah, they're great friends of ours over there, and Beth and the gang are such good people. We love any chance we get a chance to mention them, and I appreciate that. But I think it takes a special kind of person to be able to foster animals. It's not easy to do on the heart, and when you're able to do something like that, I feel like that is not only powerful, but it's also kind of speaks to a lot of what we have spoken with about you, why you've taken on this new hat that you're wearing as far as being into the political game, where you have been a mom, you've been a mother, you've been in the teaching world and all this. And again, instead of kind of easing off the brakes, you've kind of even hit harder on the gas pedal. And you know, with the fostering and then jumping into this, it speaks to somebody who it's not about titles. It's not about money for you. You're doing this because there is a passion and a care there. Nobody fosters animals because they, you know, for attention or for, you know, pomp and circumstance or anything. You do it because your heart cares about it. It feels like, and especially from what we've heard from you today, that's where you're coming from with this. You're getting into this because you care.